Alex, thank you so much for letting me come and speak with you.
My pleasure.
So I'd like you to start out by telling me who you are, what you do, where you are, and what kind of work you're doing right now.
I'm Chen Shen, Alex Liu. I'm an associate professor in the School of Public Health at Harvard University. And my research interest is looking at how people exposed to pesticides and what would be the health effect as a result of the pesticide exposure.
So specifically, exposure to pesticides, what are the health effects?
Yes.
Okay. But you've been looking at not just the health of humans, right? You've been looking at the health of bees.
Right.
Can you tell me something about that?
Well, that was the issue that started in 2007 when I learned from a TV program about a mysterious scenario that happening in Florida in terms of massive amount of honeybee disappear in the wintertime. So at the time, I treat that as another mysterious ecological problem that not necessarily related to pesticide. But once I start researching what related to bee and the health and so on, I realized that pesticide may have something to do with so-called colony collapse disorder. But I waited another 2-3 years, hoping that other bee scientists would tell us exactly why bee disappear and cause a CCD, but never have satisfactory answers. So when I first came here at Harvard University, I had the opportunity to apply for the campus-wide faculty research grant, which is very small amount of money, but I have this very interesting and in a way that very fascinating hypothesis. So I was so determined to make it happen, to make this research happen. So it took me a year to organize everything, to put all the key players in place, and we did it. But I have to say that at the time, the interest is not really just to solving the honeybee colony collapse disorders. I also believe that pesticide that their interest had something to do with human health. But at the time, in terms of human health research for those pesticides called neonicotinoid, is essentially zero. There's no research.
There's no research on, and say that again, neonicotinoids?
Yes.
And they've been used as pesticides for how many years?
So neonicotinoid has not been on the radar screen until bee colony collapse disorder. So that was 2006, 2007. But even before that, neonicotinoid as a group is the most commonly used insecticide in the world, including the United States.
No, is it an insecticide or is it a pesticide?
It's an insecticide.
So what is it?
It's an insecticide.
Right. So it's used to ward off insects eating crops as opposed to
Exactly.
weeds.
Exactly.
Interesting. And when would it come into use?
It actually started in 1990s, but not to the extent until 1998, 1999. So if you look at the pesticide usage history, for example, there's always one dominant group of that being used in different area. So we started from DDT, those organochlorine, and then we phased them out because of Silent Spring book, and then we use organophosphate for almost 30 years. By then, there's abundance of research suggesting organophosphate linking to different type of health outcome. So government took action on organophosphate, and then we move on to pyrethroid, which is another group of insecticides. So it's always kind of in tandem. There's one pesticide used and then phase out, and the other one come in, and so on and so forth. But for some reason, neonicotinoid always under the radar screen, but has been commonly used. So it was kind of like a misconnection. There's a disconnection here that we know that those pesticides has been widely used, but there's no data. And so the question is how government can approve the usage of neonicotinoid without any health effect data.
And how can they?
Well, there is a report made by American Bird Conservancy. Actually, if you read the report, you get some sense of how and why government, especially federal government, approve those pesticide use without data, because they think that this is urgently needed. Otherwise, farmer will be left without any pesticide usage.
So it was approved through like an emergency status.
Yeah.
That
And
is-
some of the EPA staff, the scientific staff, actually warned EPA that those pesticides actually could be very problematic. But US EPA decided to ignore their own internal recommendation and approve the use of neonicotinoid. And those are stated and documented in that American Bird Conservancy report, which is made public in April 2013.
So do you think it's the neonicotinoids that are causing the colony collapse disorder?
According to our bee research, yes. And the hypothesis that we have back in 2009 was something like, when we talk about genetically modified corn, it's really just adding a bacteria called Bt. Mm-hmm. And the Bt somehow render the corn plant resistant to the harm of the pesticide that farmers spray when they were still at the seedling stage. Okay, so Bt become a magical bacteria to protect corn plant, and that's part of this whole so-called Bt corn. But farmer has been planting Bt corn for almost 20 years. Guess what? Resistance show up. So none of the Bt corn retain their mojo.
None.
None.
None of the Bt corn.
Right.
None of the GMO corn.
In fact, a lot of professors and extension agent researchers actually warn USDA and EPA that you have to find a solution, otherwise those Bt corn will be useless because the rootworm problem is so severe and they don't get killed. And in part, I think they were somewhat indirectly promoting neonicotinoid use. So going back to the hypothesis that we have in 2009 was that during that time, the company that manufactured Bt corn, which is Monsanto, they need to find alternative. They need to find something else because these things is not going to work, especially in the United States. Bt corn might be still useful in other places that they don't really have a long history of planting Bt corn, but in the United States, they're useless. So they found this wonderful insecticide called neonicotinoid. The reason they can use neonicotinoid because the unique characteristic of the insecticide, which is systemic. So no other insecticide has this systemic property in which that you don't need to spray those pesticides. You just coat the seed with those pesticides when they were still the seed. And then you coat those pesticides onto the surface of the seed or even make them soak it in the concentrated water. And then by the time you plant the corn seed, the pesticide will grow with the plant to every part of the plant.
So it gets incorporated in all the cells.
Exactly. So the residue of the pesticide that used to be in the seed will be translocated to every part of the plant, including corn, including the pollen, including the leaf, and then agglutation come out from the leaf.
And what about including the animal that eats the plant?
That part we don't know. But what happened is that the corn that we harvest from those genetically modified crop are made for something else, right? So one thing that really put the corn in use is so-called high fructose corn syrup. So it's a liquid sugar water. It was predominantly used in beverage industry and other processed food. Somehow, commercial beekeepers start using high fructose corn syrup in late 1990s because they found the honey actually is a very valuable commodity. So they scrap off all the honey at the end of the season, right? But they had to put sugar back to the hive, otherwise the bee has no food during the winter. So they've been using high fructose corn syrup. But it was fine, although some beekeeper questioned about the nutrition content of high fructose corn syrup, but not to the extent that feeding beehive with high fructose corn syrup would kill the whole colony until Monsanto experimented this practice by coating their seed with neonicotinoid. That was 2005, 2006. And guess what? A year later, they wiped out 95% of the colony in this country within the commercial beekeeper industry. So that was my hypothesis. My hypothesis can be supported by the fact that what's going on in the field. So we went out to get a bucket of clean high fructose corn syrup, which is no neonicotinoid, and then we put some neonicotinoid. In this case, we use imidacloprid, which is the most commonly used neonicotinoid in the world, not just in the United States. So those level of imidacloprid in high fructose corn syrup that we added to does not kill the bee right away, meaning the bee were still healthy during the time that we feed them those pesticide contaminated high fructose corn syrup. But guess what? 23 weeks later, the hive that we treated with imidacloprid, they just die one after another. They not only die one after another, the way that they die, the post-mortem observation that we have are consistent to the report of CCD.
No, in the CCD case, in the colony collapse case, they weren't having high fructose corn syrup with the insecticide. They were eating high fructose corn syrup made from corn with the nicotinide.
Right. Right.
With the neonicotinoids.
Right.
So
we basically, the experiment that we did in 2011, 2012, basically mimic what commercial beekeeper has been doing in their own professions. And the only factor that we put it into the experiment is adding those imidacloprid to the high fructose corn syrup. And also we set up a control hive right next to the pesticide hive. And the control hive all survived. And only one died, but died of the disease that is very different to those CCD hive. So we published the paper and got a huge pushback.
what was the pushback?
Well, the pushback was saying that it's a very small study. Dr. Lu treated the hive way too high. It's not the level to be encountered in the environment, and so on and so forth. And so we actually have a very difficult time to publish that paper in the United States.
Who were you turned down by?
We have been rejected by 4 or 5 different journals. And some of them actually went through the peer review. And the peer reviews comment, as a researcher in my job for almost 16 years, those comments were nowhere close to be constructive, collegial, or positive.
What can you give me an example? I mean,
for example, they criticized the way that we spell honeybee to be 1 word or 2 words. They challenged the CCD is a global phenomenon. The reviewers said the CCD only limited in the United States, and so on. So that's what I'm saying. It's not only the comment are very, very destructive. It's not actually professional. And when we review a paper, a manuscript, the purpose is to help the author to get the manuscript published, unless it's really, really something that should not be published. So we did it in a way that to support our colleague and get the paper published. But on the other, but for some reason, this bee paper was so suppressed. It seems like there's a gigantic wall built by somebody else that you cannot penetrate. So we decided to publish in another journal in Italy. And we actually have similar comments. But once we addressed the comments, we were able to get the paper accepted and published. And that led to a lot of public attentions about whether that pesticide is really the cause. And that paper, fortunately or unfortunately, that we published in Europe, that was included in the European Union's decision to temporarily ban those pesticides for 2 years. So the paper was cited. Our paper was cited in the final documentation that was finally approved by the European Congress, and then they took an action, whereas that paper never been cited by our government in the United States.
And how long ago was that in Europe?
2012.
2012. So it's still under moratorium.
Yeah.
Well, I find that the European Union tends to use more precautionary principle.
Right. So the precautionary principle is actually written in the European Union constitution.
Oh, no wonder why.
It's their constitution saying that if there is something that causes environmental damage, although there are variations associated with the finding, as long as the finding is scientifically credible, government need to take action. And that's the major differences between European Union and United States.
And so have we seen colonies come back in Europe? I mean, has there
So-
been improvement since they've put a
I
moratorium
think
on
it's
the
too
use of
early to say. I think they just started this temporary ban. So I think in 2 years we should know. But I think there's a huge caveat here is that who actually do the tallying, who actually monitoring the status of the economy in Europe. I think there, in my opinion, there's a huge penetration from industry, especially policy like this. So they obviously wanna get the result in favor of their stand, not the government's argument. So I think the policy by taking those neonicotinoids away from the agricultural use for 2 years is a very good policy. But my concern is that if in the process of monitoring the health of the economy in Europe has to be independent, has to be very neutral. Otherwise, the outcome is still not very good.
So the question I have would be that the professional beekeepers, they are only harmed in this, right? I mean, what do the professional beekeepers say? What do the behavioral or the apiary specialists, the bee specialists say about this? Again, the beekeepers can only be harmed if they're losing their colonies. Where are they in this debate?
I think this is a very interesting question. I think the professional beekeepers are very unique in the sense they are not a big industry, so they kind of help each other. As long as there's one leader making the call, most people will listen to that person, but they don't know exactly who that person is, who actually this person is working for. One of the person that always writing the email to criticize our paper that published actually is a commercial beekeeper.
Really?
Yeah, so when I asked him this question about why you are so object to our findings in which try to protect your honeybees, and he really had no answer. So if you are a beekeeper and you has been suffering from the CCDs, and then somebody in Boston published a paper saying this could be the reason that you lost so many hives, why you are so object to?
It doesn't make any sense. There might be things going on that we
Right.
have no idea.
And this person eventually become one of the key person in a company called Biologist, which was bought by Monsanto a couple of
well,
months ago.
that's your answer, isn't it?
Right.
That's exactly what I was starting
Right.
to think, is
Right.
that maybe these beekeepers are getting
Right.
monetarily
Right.
reimbursed somehow.
Right. So a lot of commercial beekeepers may agree with what the study finding, but I think they're probably not in the position to express a totally different opinion to the people that run this whole organizations.
So in Bee Logic, does they organize the beekeepers to move the bees around to pollinate?
Biologist used to be an independent bee research companies, but just because Monsanto and other pesticide companies realized that neonicotinoid is very important to their business and it's being challenged, so they need to have a bee research company so they can, in a way that they're kind of producing the result that they want.
So Alex, what would happen if all the bees were gone? What would happen to our farming culture, our food chain? Do you know?
In fact, I can tell you right now that the bee population as a whole, their health is deteriorating. I think I saw the data showing that in 2010, we only had 50% of the colony left after World War II, meaning that within that 60-year period, in the United States, we lost half of the colony for any reason. That is really alarming because bee is somehow very, very unique in terms of being a pollinator. There's only one pollinator, which is honeybee, that can do such an efficient job pollinating the tree. In other words, if you say we have another 50% colony die this year, the first industry is going to suffer from huge economic loss will be almond in California, because we produce 95% of almond in the world to feed the food. Yeah.
And almond trees.
And almond trees somehow has to be pollinated by bee for two reasons. One, their massive growth, right? In this small area in the middle of a central valley in California, if you don't have bee, which is millions of bee, right? You cannot accomplish pollination within that short period of a window, which is 10 days to 2 weeks. So that's one thing. The other thing is that at the time, the temperature is still relatively cold. We were talking about early March, right? If you don't have a healthy honeybee colony, they could not go out and work. So that is alarming. And then you think about other places like Washington State, Oregon. They have a lot of tree orchards. We're talking about apples and pears and cherry and so on and so forth. You think about Massachusetts, we have cranberries, right? Blueberries. You think about in Florida, we have citrus industry. Those are heavily dependent upon honeybee pollination. And there's no other natural pollinator can take over honeybee's job.
But is there an artificial way of pollinating that perhaps some of these companies are working on?
Well, it looked like that they are developing these robotic bees, or so-called genetically modified bees. The critical point here is that the honeybee, if there is something going on within honeybee colony that prohibits them from overwinter, then the colony die. So overwinter is a key right now. In our study shows pesticide that harm them in a way, not kill them right away, but
they can't pollinate.
They cannot live through the winter. So usually CCD happen during the winter month or toward the end of winter month, meaning that this colony somehow lost their ability to overwinter. So the key point is what caused their inability of overwintering. Our government research suggests it's all because of the pathogen infestations. But my argument is that if really caused by those pathogens, right, most of the bee would die in the hive. But CCD is not.
They die out of the hive.
You cannot see the dead bee.
Right, they're gone. They just disappear.
Yeah.
Well, and the pathogens have been around always, so what's making them susceptible to
Exactly.
the pathogen? Why suddenly? They've evolved with all these pathogens.
Exactly.
But I have to bring you back to this one point. So the same companies that presumably are contributing or causing this colony collapse disorder are now coming up with drone bees to do the work of bees. So then they would own the world's pollination. I mean, so everything that we know in terms of tree fruits and tree nuts would be owned by them.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, if they make it successful.
So these are not actually bees. They're not insects. They're not live beings. They're robotic, mechanical entities, correct?
Well, if you think about it, they can make bee just like genetically modified corn or genetically modified soybeans. So before we have those GMO, farmers know how to save seeds for next year, right? So now, because of GMO, you couldn't. You have to buy seed from the company every year because they put up this enzyme that kill the vitality of those seeds. Bee is the same thing because the natural bee cannot overwinter. So they probably die out through the winter, right? So they can come up with genetically modified bee. So what? They die out in the winter because next spring you buy bee from me and they will pollinate your crops.
So, and we think they're working on this.
I think they're working on it. I think there are a couple of so-called rumors that, like for example, the almond industry, they collectively develop this kind of bee, which is not genetically modified, but they are not designed to pollinate. But somehow they feel like this is probably our safety. If the bee cannot work, then at least we have this traditional bee that don't really pollinate that efficiently, but at least they have something else. I think there are people testing so-called genetically modified bee, see whether they can pollinate, but die out through the winter, and they can buy it again. Another possibility would be to introduce another species of bee, which is not native to North America, called Africanized Italian bee. Do you know what those are?
Are those the killer bees?
Exactly.
And the problem with them?
Well, there's a couple of problems. One, they are very violent. That's why they call killer bees.
Yeah.
So I don't think they are appropriate for pollination. Second, they cannot withstand the cold winter.
If they're from Africa.
Right, that's why. So I think that the killer bee can survive in Texas or Arizona, but nothing north of those states. So it might be difficult to bring those killer bee to the north to pollinate almond, for example. They claim that those killer bee are tougher and stronger against pesticides. So that part suits their interest very well. But I think it would be a huge mistake to bring Africanized Italian bee to United States, because I don't even want to think about the consequences. Can you imagine that in our environment there's always killer bee around?
They go out and sting everybody? I mean, it's...
Yeah. So they're in a way they're very aggressive.
They're very aggressive.
The Italian bee that we used to have, they actually are very nice ladies. As long as you don't bother them, they don't bother you. If you have the intention to harm their colony, then they will come out and sting you. But if you just leave them alone, they leave you alone. Usually the injury happens not because of honeybee, because of yellow jacket or Africanized Italian bee. Can you imagine that we have those killer bee around? That would be something that I would not want to have in my backyard.
So the other thing brings up the question about honey. If bees, unless it's organic honey, honey that's raised on, created on an organic environment, people are eating honey and the honey must be loaded with the neonicotinoid.
It's a very interesting question. So I think you can call yourself as organic beekeeper, but I don't think you have control in terms of where bee will go, unless you know that within this 3-mile radius, that where the beehive is set up, there's no pesticides. Then I would say that honey from the hive will be likely organic honeys. But once bees fly out to the environment, they can forage whatever they want, right? There's really not much control the beekeeper has in terms of whether my bee only go to the organic field, not go to the conventional. So you're right. Honey could become a good indicator of whether your bee has visited somewhere else that has a pesticide residue, either honey or pollen.
So the other question I have is, there must be some countries, maybe, that have not used the neonicotinoids. And what is the quality of their bee colony? What's the quality of their bee colonies right now? Do we know?
I don't think there is a place that's free of neonicotinoid because, again, neonicotinoid is the most commonly used insecticides. I don't think there is one.
Well, only Europe right now. There's a moratorium for 2 years.
Yeah,
but
hopefully. But you know what? The other thing about the neonicotinoid is that they actually behave similar to DDT in terms of their biological half-life. Once you put those neonicotinoid in the environment, say for example, inject it in the soil, and the soil leach out to your groundwater aquifer, their half-life is as long as DDT if you apply those neonicotinoid on a yearly basis.
And does Monsanto make this neonicotinoid as
No.
well? No, it's not Monsanto.
No, Monsanto is not a pesticide manufacturer.
Well, they make Roundup, but that's...
They make Roundup. That's the only one they make.
But not insecticide. So who's making...
A lot of those big players, Bayer Crop Science, Syngenta, BASF, yes.
Okay, so we have these companies making this insecticide that there's evidence now, since we've been using it, the bees have been dying off. And none of the companies did safety studies, and none of the governments insisted on safety studies. Has neonicotinoids been used in medicine? Had it been used before? Why did all these governments just assume that there were no safety studies?
Government ignore the fact that those neonicotinoids are systemic. But the industry used systemic as a clause to support the safety of their product, because they tell government that you don't have to spray neonicotinoid.
Oh, I see.
You inject it to the soil. You put it on the seed, right? So there's really no open air application. there's no crop duster flying over the field and dump
I
those
see.
neonicotinoids. So because of that, government said, sure.
So it was never a concern how it would be when it was ingested or bioaccumulated.
Exactly. And pesticides were never being tested in the consumer market in terms of whether there would be a health until the epidemiology results suggest that there is an adverse effect.
And what are the epidemiological, what is the epidemiological results study? Like, what do they imply in terms of, so there's nothing, there's no studies on this, but
There are some animal data, but there's no epidemiology data.
There's none.
None.
Do we know how they affect a body? What do they block? What do how do they work in a
So
system?
if you do a toxicological testing, right? So neonicotinoid inhibit a receptor called nicotinic acetylcholinesterase, which is an important receptor that is responsible for your neurological functions, right? But we do know now that pesticide and other chemical as well likely to insert their action other than that specific mechanistic pathway that we know.
So neonicotinoids were not used in World War I or II as nerve gas. This does not come from that.
It's not coming from the organophosphate part of the family. It's actually from the nicotine part.
But there are other nerve toxins that have been used in warfare that work similarly, that work on the acetylcholinesterase.
Right, but it's the organophosphate act on the enzyme itself, but neonicotinoid act on the receptor. Yeah, so it's different.
Wow, it's really scary. It's to imagine a world without bees. I can't even imagine. It seems really sad for me. How does it affect you? I mean, are you a father? Are you a parent? Do you?
If you look at my research and the statement that I put out, the paper that I published, I never call for ban specific pesticide. I actually call for responsible usage. I do believe that there will be a balance that the farmer use pesticides to whatever they want to serve their best interests. But by the time the farmers harvest their crop, there will be very little or none residues. And I would say that would be a perfect scenario. But for neonicotinoid, I do have to say that we need to ban them. They are not supposed to be part of this whole society. What I can say is that we learned from our current study that the harm that neonicotinoid could do, not only to honeybee, but human health as well, is beyond what we know. And that could be a huge public health threat.
I would imagine it could affect cognition
Yes.
and physical movement, because acetylcholine is a very important neurotransmitter.
There are already studies from countries like Japan, for example. They see that neonicotinoid, the level that don't cause any harm that you can measure right away, but affect brain functions, especially brain function in kids, in fetus, in newborns. They've done this in the rodent studies, not human.
Rodent.
Yeah,
and
can
you tell me what the rodents look like? What could they not learn? Did they have hyperactivity? Did they have anxiety, social anxiety?
So there are markers that you can collect from animals like mice or rats.
Absolutely, they're smart. They're really smart animals.
Right. So I mean, there are actually data from those animal studies suggesting that neonicotinoid could trigger disease like ADHD, autism, those type of neural impairment.
Sure.
If you think about, if those animal studies suggesting those neurodevelopmental hazards, then you can also interpret the way that they could also cause neurodegenerative disease.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
so,
because they are on the same spectrum. It depends upon the age of the individuals.
Right, in the stage of development.
Right.
And exactly.
Exactly.
And I know that acetylcholine is very, very important in terms of the whole vegetative or rest and relaxation state.
Think about this statement. I work with 2 beekeepers. They are not scientific person. They are just experienced beekeepers.
They understand bee behavior.
Oh yeah, they understand more than anybody else. That's why it took me a year to find my collaborators. When I proposed this idea, they were actually quite skeptical about whether Dr. Lu's idea makes sense. All right. I think if you read the Boston Globe article, you kind of get a sense about how they look at me, and so on and so forth. And I mean, seriously, before Christmas 2010, they thought that Dr. Lu's experiment failed because nobody died. They were actually fine. And they're about to go on vacation. And right there, we start getting phone call from people that we set up a beehive in their backyard. They say, oh, your hive died, one after another, right? Guess what they told me? They said, those bees must be crazy because they are not supposed to go out in the winter. That's their instinct. Just like one hive has only one queen, there's no two queens. That's their instinct. But somehow, in the middle of the winter, which the ground also covered by the snow, those bees willing to go out, and obviously they die because they cannot survive in the winter. So what's going on? And they knew that those hives only treated with pesticide, whereas the control hive sit next to them are fine.
And they didn't go out.
So their first reaction to witness the CCD in our experimental site were, those bees are crazy, because they didn't die right away.
And the studies in Japan with the rodents, with the mice and the rats.
Yeah.
The rats and the mice looked
So they
cognitively impaired.
Right. So they introduced very low level of neonicotinoid, in this case imidacloprid, the same pesticide, the insecticide that we use in our first study, and they see those outcomes. So that prompted us to do another study, year 2 study, which is the data that we are collecting and writing a paper right now. The result actually very, very shocking.
But you're not going to shock me today with it. I would love you to. Can you shock me today with it?
Well,
Or
I just don't know how quickly my paper can be published. But we can come back and talk about this.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's really scary stuff. I mean, one last question. Do you think, well, actually, okay, so one last question regarding the government. The EPA, do they know about your studies? Do they care? You know, have you talked to anybody at the EPA? That's one question. And the other question I'd like you to address would be, you know, have you looked around the country and seen academic centers that should be doing work on this, either that were doing work on this or should be, change gears or switch gears and go away from this, or say the contrary? And if so, have you seen ties, you know, have you seen unusual things? Have you seen, you know, BASF or Bayer or Monsanto CFOs or CEOs coming into these academic centers and suddenly becoming part of the academic center? I mean, what have you seen going on
So when
that no one else, why isn't anyone else doing this incredible research?
So when we have the data from our first study, I actually wrote a letter to the US EPA Administrator, Lisa Jackson. I sent the same letter to the Director of Office of Pesticide Program to basically tell them the result. I consider that as a very significant outcome because directly we prove pesticides issue. Obviously, Mr. Lisa Jackson resigned from her post. The director of OPP is still there, but he made no mention of that study.
So you heard nothing from them?
Right, exactly.
Amazing.
And I even wrote another letter to him to directly respond to the criticism that made by the Bayer crop industry in terms of...
And you heard nothing?
I heard nothing.
So here you are, associate professor at Harvard in the School of Public Health, and you write...
And that's not really broken my heart. The thing that really broke my heart was that EPA decided to host a scientific advisory panel to discuss the pesticide harm to the honeybees. That was the first panel meetings. I have been invited by US EPA to attend that specific panel meeting since 2004. Every time I was invited, I submit my documentation, they approve it, and I physically show up in the meeting and discuss the content and wrote a report. This time I was invited.
You were or wasn't?
I was.
You were, okay.
And then I was de-invited.
You were de-invited?
Yeah.
You were uninvited. Wait, you've been invited every year.
Yeah.
You contact the EPA to let them know that your research shows there's a problem with
Right.
neonicotinoids, and you get invited and then uninvited.
Right.
And what did the invitation say? I don't even know what to call it. It's an uninvitation.
Well, so they basically say that, I mean, he is the person that coordinated the meeting, right? So he called me one day and said, Dr. Lu, unfortunately, I have to tell you that you are de-invited to this panel meeting. And I said, well, I know that you are just coordinating this whole process, but I do really want to know, so what is the reason? Do I have a conflict of interest? Usually it's the conflict of interest that make you
Sure.
de-invited, right? Because
Right.
you have to submit the paperwork and show,
Right.
if you own like 1 million share of Monsanto stock, then you couldn't go to the meeting.
Or maybe those are the only people going to the meeting.
But he said that's not really the case. The case is that we found the expertise that you have, meaning they found somebody else that will fill in my seat on the panel. So my question is that who else?
Did you ask?
I didn't, because
Well,
I know that he's not really the person to make a decision. I don't want to make him feel bad about it. But I thought about this. I said, well, maybe there are some other people that do pesticide research that I can live with that. But pesticide and colony collapse disorder, especially these pesticides, I don't think there's anybody else in this country could do a better job as independent scientists to discuss this subject at EPA.
Did you have them put it in writing? I'm just curious.
No, they would never put it in writing.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting.
They don't even send me an email, they call me.
Yeah, they don't want any written documentation
No.
that they're
But
uninviting you.
the response from the OPP was that we found other expertise.
And
to
has this
replace-
event happened?
It already happened.
Do you know who it was sitting at your...
I didn't know. But there's no other people on the panel could do a better job to discuss this subject than I would do.
And this is the EPA.
This is
So this is
EPA.
a governmental agency.
Yeah. So that really broke my heart. That really broke my heart. So that is something that I will never forget.
Something you'll never forget.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think about that? I mean, that's a sad statement.
So something actually very interesting happened at the beginning of May 2013. European Union decided to implement this 2-year ban, right? And 2 days later, US EPA and USDA host a press release of the report. Basically, the report is totally different to the European Union decisions. The report basically said that, we look at these things, which is multifactorial, that cause colony collapse disorders. We're going to spend another 5 to 10 years to study exactly what caused that so we can take a better approach. In the meantime, we're going to implement a couple policies to make sure that we protect honeybee from whatever harm that would be. And none of the things that they state in the report are specific enough that you would believe that honeybee health in this country will be protected. But the worst is that although the press release was co-hosted by USDA and EPA, they said that whatever say in the report does not represent government's position. So who actually wrote the report? That's the question.
Oh, industry. I mean,
Right, so the report is a proceeding from 2 meetings, one symposium, one workshop, all hosted by the industry.
well, there's no
But
surprise.
there's another question, interesting question that we should ask the public, American people, is that majority of the neonicotinoid are manufactured by European-based company, Syngenta, Bayer Crop Science. They couldn't convince their government their products are safe to honeybees, but somehow they're able to convince our government that their product's safe.
Well, that seems to be the theme in a lot of the things that we're investigating for this movie, is that for some reason, the United States is probably the best government you can buy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what about the other part of my question, which is academia? Have you seen this kind of behavior coming from academic centers?
So one part of academic research, quite obvious, is the agricultural research. So a long time ago, the government actually initiated a very good policy in terms of establishing those land-grant university, right? So in those land-grant universities, they have this so-called very strong and very active agricultural research, which actually benefit a lot of farmers, right? But over the time, those agrochemical industry understand how they can play this game. so they can bring government, which in this case USDA, and farmers together in this extension agent that, if we can sponsor their research, then obviously we can influence their decision, their technology, and so on and so forth. So the GMO is a perfect example why so quickly the GMOs can populate it across the country just because of endorsement from our USDA, right? And then we apply those technology to the farmers, so farmer can do everything just one stop with Monsanto. And they are replicating this in this whole honeybee scenario because they believe that if we can bring USDA, in this case EPA too, together with some of the commercial beekeeper, nobody can break this alliance, and we can do whatever we want. So when you look around, when CCD just happened, U.S. Congress actually appropriate certain amount of money to USDA to do the research.
Oh my.
Okay, people like me has no access to that part of the money. In fact, there are some entomologists in different universities argue that how USDA use those money.
Yeah, be really nice to know.
Right, how they use the money. So my observation was that since 2006, since the CCD story broke, industry quickly formed the alliances and have those people publish paper in the journals, right? So those people form the peer review pool, right?
So they have control
They
over
have the
what is being
control,
published right
they
now.
have the control. So people that never belong to this fraternity or sororities, that your paper will have a hard time to go through their peer review process. And that's what happened to us. One question that I got from those nasty, harassing email was that, what do you have been in this whole big research? They even criticized that in the paper that we publish, who can claim themselves as a bee researcher?
Yeah, it's amazing. Now, what's going on in other parts of the world in terms of this research?
So European Union actually look at this very seriously, and that's why they have those bans. There's many people, researchers across the European continent, they believe that pesticide is the culprit of this whole CCD issues. Actually, more studies show up right now in the literature in terms of documenting the hazard of those neonicotinoids to honeybee, either acutely or chronically.
What's going on in Asia, in China?
Well, Asia, they still have the problem, but somehow they don't really have the CCD problem, I think, in part because most of the Asian countries are in the much warmer regions.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, winter is a key season.
So you need to have winter. There must be winter to see the colony collapse disorder. That's a key ingredient.
Right. Almost, I can tell you this: a country that has a very obvious winter season, and they also have the neonicotinoid usage. They will have CCD.
So Russia is seeing this problem as well.
Japan has CCD. I never heard of Korea, but Japan has CCD. Their NHK did a CCD documentary about 2-3 years ago. There's 3 hotspots in Japan that always has a CCD problem. So Canada has CCD problem. So it's a global phenomenon for sure, especially country in a colder region.
Mm-hmm. So if it's a warm region, the bees won't die from this neonicotinoid
likely.
because their abnormal behavior will not kill them.
They die not inconsistent to CCD symptoms.
Wow, very serious stuff. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.